It's actually a particularly good day for me to be here for this reason. Mayor Emanuel's first budget was passed today by the tight margin of 50 to nothing. And in some respects, while we still have some sort of equivalence of a sort of honeymoon that will continue for a little while, in very many important respects, I think that the passage of the budget really marks the end of a significant transition period. We had about a 7-month period between the time that Mayor Daley indicated that he was not going to run for re-election until Mr. Emanuel became mayor, and 6 months to the day his first budget's passed. We've had a 13-month transition. And during that time, my office has seen a lot of things happen. It's a very interesting time when 22 years of history moves on, 22 years of a certain way of doing business tied to the way business was done for the previous 50 years. And it comes together with circumstances that compel and demand real change. And those circumstances are largely driven by the fiscal situation that we've been in going back almost 5 years now. And so Mr. Emanuel comes in. He has connections to the past, but he is articulating a vision that is very much forward-looking, not critical in a naming fashion of what's going on in the past, but critical in sort of a substantive fashion of what has happened and what has brought us to the challenging times that we are in. And actually had to, walking in the door, he and his people spend a whole lot of time really understanding, coming to understand all of the imbalances, the inequities, the oddities, the sort of Rube Goldberg contraptions that had evolved from the simple fact that we had one person running the city for 22 years. And that took a while. And in that period, the mayor also had to put together his first budget. The budget has to be balanced by law. He has balanced it by law. And so what I want to do is actually say some positive things about Mayor Emanuel. Don't tell him. This isn't the Mayor Emanuel fan club, is it? Right? All right. So what has been accomplished? We've balanced the budget. We've always balanced the budget. We have to as a matter of law. And probably in tonight's news and tomorrow's news, the passage of a balanced budget is going to be treated as a cause for celebration, and with good reason. It's balanced in part through some meaningful programmatic changes in how the city delivers services. A most noteworthy example of that is moving to a grid-based system of garbage collection and introducing managed competition with respect to recycling services. It's significant for this reason. It is a major first step in the centralization of what historically has been a ward-based delivery of services in the city. That's not necessarily a bad thing to have ward-based delivery of services. It means for all of you who live in the city, for me who lives in the city, I have to do that as a matter of law, so I have to make sure that everybody understands I live in the city, it means that actually we have somebody that we can call in our neighborhood who can assure, assuming that we voted for him, that there is a responsiveness to some immediate need that we have with respect to city services. So it's not necessarily a bad thing, but the way that it has been managed over the years really is rooted in an inefficient anachronism dating back to the ward healer patronage system of the past. And so Mayor Daley actually tried in recent years on a number of occasions to make some form of inroad into centralization of services and cutting into the ward-based delivery of services, and immediately was met each time with all sorts of wails and screams and all that sort of stuff, and he would back off very quickly. The fiscal circumstances that we found ourselves in has allowed us to sort of push through that barrier that has long existed. Mayor Emanuel should take credit for that. He's also balanced the budget without resort to some of the more notable budgeting tricks of recent years. This budget is balanced without a significant drawdown of reserves and one-time revenue sources, as has been seen for many years running now. It has been done without the use of vacancies as a budget-saving mechanism. I note that one particularly because if you look back at the last 3, 4, 5 years of budgets, what you will see, and I only came to know this from actually working inside the city, what you will see is a pledge by the prior administration to provide services at this level. These are the number of workers, this is the amount of resources that we are going to apply to all sorts of services. And the reality was, underneath the surface, not known to the public, that the real commitment was only going to be to here. The difference was stated budget allocations for personnel and all sorts of things that the city knew it could not afford. So you, the individual taxpayer, thinks you're getting these services and the city is pledging services at this level. The reality is that you don't know about is it's only going to be here. Internally, that makes it very challenging to be to head a department, to be a manager in a department. The reason is what that delta is between here and here. For your department, you don't necessarily know. It's a constantly shifting thing. You do not know what resources the office of the mayor is going to make available to you to provide the services that you're responsible for providing. And so there's all sorts of oddities that have evolved over the last 4 or 5 years where you have the heads of departments constrained to not violate the prime directive of the old order, which was loyalty. Thou shalt not speak ill of the mayor, thou shalt not be critical of the circumstances that one is in. So you really can't say, we're hurting here publicly. You've got to deal with that situation, and you don't even know what that situation is because it can change on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. And you, the public, really did not know that. So what Mayor Emanuel has done is said, no more of at least that sort of mechanism that results in this difference between what is being publicly pledged and what is actually going to be committed to services. We're going to say it's actually here. And we're going to let the department heads have full access to those actual resources. So you should see better run departments simply from the acknowledgement that there had been this delta, there will be no more. Along the way, Mayor Emanuel has made very public, his budget director, his chief financial officer, have stated that we've had a structural deficit for 10 years. We only started talking about structural deficits in the last couple of years. And the fact of the matter is we've had structural deficits going back a good decade. That's really important for this reason. This balanced budget doesn't get us to the end of the road with respect to all of the hard decisions that need to be made, the reconstitution of how services are delivered, the reconstitution as to how government is organized and operated in the city. We have a number of challenges ahead of us. And to understand that what we have gone through the last few years is not simply the product of a drop in revenues that came from the crash in the real estate market and the drop in the economy, which we'd all like to think is truly cyclical and we'll move on from that. It's actually there's something much bigger that's been going on here in Chicago. And the mayor and his finance team have acknowledged that. And so what we've done this year, it's really just the first step in a multi-year process to address greater structural imbalances and deficits that actually still lurk beneath the surface. The most obvious one that everyone in this room, I understand you're all really well read, you keep up with everything, so I'm going to assume you all know this, but the pensions. We haven't addressed that in any way, shape, or form. And here's what we know. 2012 comes in 6 weeks. That puts us about 2 years away from the ratcheting up of our state-driven legal obligation to increase our funding to the public safety pensions, police and fire, on the order of about $500 million a year. That's $500 million structural deficit that's just sitting there beneath the surface. We know if we look beyond the core city budget to all the sister agencies, we have other structural problems that exist. The last 3 years, The teachers' union budget, the teachers' pension system, there's been a holiday on the payment of money to that system as well. That's going to ratchet up a year from now. When I mentioned the ratcheting up of the public safety pension funds, 2014, that doesn't address the fact that there are two other major pension funds in the city that have the same sort of gross underfunding that we know exists in the public safety pensions. Those need to be addressed as well. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars structural deficit that is on the immediate time horizon. So what we have done, what the administration has done with this first budget, it's just a first step. And it's a first step that they had to take in a very short time frame. A first step that they had to take, basically carrying forward a lot of the budgeting system of the past. And so the real changes start now. The real measure of the administration is not what happened with this budget. It is what they do in the next year, in the next 2 years. And so that's just on the budgeting front. The administration's also done a number of other things. It's spoken to transparency. It's spoken to accountability. If you look on the city's website, you will see lots more information than you have ever seen before. And the mayor has some wonderful folks that he has brought in from the outside to work on driving more and more data and information onto the city website. So it's available to you all. And they're selling that as real reform, real transparency. Here, so I've said a bunch of nice things. We're all going to feel good for a few days. But what I want to impress upon you is this is actually where the real work starts. We just have addressed this transition period. The real work has to start now. Change is what we have effected to address our immediate circumstances. Change is not and should not be confused with reform. Change in certain budgeting mechanisms is not reform in a way that addresses the long-term structural deficit situation. Change in the amount of information that is available to you publicly is not reform as it relates to transparency and accountability. Do not let the feel-good relief moment of a balanced budget on a far more honest basis than we have seen in the past delude you into thinking we're good. We're not. We have a long way to go. We got the low-hanging fruit and then a little bit more. So let's give the mayor credit. Give him a round of applause. Now let's get back to work. So there are a number of things that are going to make the real changes difficult. Back in the spring, we issued, my office issued a report on motor truck drivers and the city's utilization of motor truck drivers. Not the most scintillating reading, but it tells a fascinating story of how the city has worked in the past and how hard it's going to be to really change things forward going. And it started out from one of the supervisors in our office coming into the building where we work. It's not a huge building, and it's not a total secret that we are there. And on the way in, he sees a city painter painting a curb yellow and painting a fire hydrant red. And there is a truck parked outside. And in the truck is a city driver. And the city driver sits in the truck. And he watches the city driver, and the city driver sits in the truck. Comes back in, he's all hot and bothered. All right, let's take a picture of it. Let's take a video of it. Does that, we should open up an investigation. We have the truck, we know what the truck is, and therefore we know what the driver is. The driver's been loafing. And we get complaints about that sort of thing all the time. We all see it. If you live in the city, if you work in the city, you see large work crews, one or two guys working, a whole lot of guys, and they're guys, seeming to be standing around doing nothing. And And we could spend all of our time chasing after those individual situations. We can't, and one of the emphases of the office under my predecessor, David Hoffman, that I'm carrying forward with is we don't chase around one-offs, what we call one-offs, sort of individualized, narrow situations of minor misconduct. We're looking for the programmatic stuff. The question was asked, why is it, how is it that a city worker, a truck driver, sitting in a truck, outside the offices of the Inspector General can feel so comfortable about just sitting there? We all think it's loafing. You think it's loafing. And so we examined motor truck drivers and how they're used in the city. And what we found out was he wasn't loafing. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing. And he had to be there, although he's happy to be there just sitting, I'm sure. But he had to be there with the painter because of work rules that are enshrined in collective bargaining agreements. And some of the aspects of those work rules, there are a certain number of people that have to be on a particular type of work crew. That work crew has to be constituted of certain types of expertise from various realms. And in this particular instance, the motor truck driver, contractually and by long-standing past practices, cannot do any of the work of the painter, and the painter cannot do any of the work of the motor truck driver. Never the twain shall meet. If the twain meets, there's going to be a grievance. And that's another one of the prime directives that exists in the city historically: thou shalt not be grieved. And so everyone is just doing their job. And so then we ask management, mid-level management, senior management, department heads, commissioners, have you ever tried to change this? The answer was, yes, we have. There are actually provisions in the collective bargaining agreement with the Teamsters that allow for some degree of outsourcing, private contracting, some degree of change. Well, why haven't you actually been able to do it? Well, when we tried, we were grieved. Well, the contract allows for some of this. Well, there's side agreements. What side agreements? We looked at the contract. We don't see any side agreements that are attached or incorporated by reference. There's side agreements. There's written side agreements. There's oral side agreements. There's agreements that come out of internal grievance processes. There are side agreements that come out of settlements in arbitrations. And all of these things sort of locked in past practices and traditional work. And so if you try something innovative, you're going to run up against them. There were a few interesting things about that. One was we went to look for these side agreements and found that there was no single repository of them for them. No one in the city actually had a handle on what they were. There was no place even where the written ones were all gathered together so that somebody could analyze what our actual situation is in terms of operations and staffing requirements, and what our flexibility might be to change them forward going. And beyond that, we said, well, look, how can you have these written agreements? Let's just work with the written ones, because there it is in writing. Some people have inked their signatures. Maybe there's been initials and they've been sort of reanimated and extended over time. How can you have these things that actually have the effect of, at best, limiting and at worst, completely defeating the terms of a collective bargaining agreement? Somebody says, well, contract. The collective bargaining agreement is not just a contract, it is passed as a law. So what you have, passed by the city council, introduced by the mayor as an ordinance, city council passes it, and then everybody moves forward, and there are these side agreements, oral and written, that defeat the very terms of the law. How? I went to law school. You can't do that. Well, that's the way it's always been. And it is the way it's always been. I don't think the aldermen knew of it. They're not attached to the collective bargaining agreements. Let's assume that the aldermen actually read the collective bargaining agreements when they're introduced as ordinances into the city council. These agreements aren't referenced in any way, shape, or form. And so the consequences of what it is that they're agreeing to aren't even fully known to them. why is that a big deal? Contracts have to be renegotiated regularly. Well, with respect to the 37 trade unions representing city workers, the trades in the city, 37 of these agreements were passed as ordinances by the City Council in December of 2007. They're all 10-year agreements. There's no such thing in this type of realm, with this type of work, as a 10-year collective bargaining agreement. The NFL, hopefully the NBA at some point, I'm a basketball fan, let them have their 10-year agreements. But we're talking about truck drivers. We're talking about sort of ordinary business operations that have to evolve to meet evolving needs of constituents, that ought to be able to evolve in a way that allows for the introduction of new technology. No, we're locked into them. We're locked into them for 10 years. Why? Because back in 2007, we were bidding for the Olympics, the 2016 Olympics. And one of the things that started to bubble up with respect to the World Cup hosting and the Olympic hosting were labor problems that put at risk, the commitments made for building. And so to bolster our proposal to get the 2016 Olympics, we said we're going to have labor peace, lock them in for 10 years. So Rahm Emanuel is stuck with these things all the way through his first term and beyond, assuming he continues beyond a first term. I know that there's speculation about what his ultimate objectives are, but let's just assume. He's 6 years in before he actually can renegotiate most of these things. And that's why it's going to be a real challenge to change some of the way that we do business. It's going to put a lot of pressure on the mayor to take on those unions whose collective bargaining agreements come up sooner than 2017. And so in 2012, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with police, fire, and AFSCME. That's a big deal. Police and fire, that's close to 2/3 of the core city budget right there. And there are a lot of benefits and work rule related stuff, lots of consideration built into those collective bargaining agreements, not as a matter really of anything corrupt or anything like that. It's just sort of been an accretion over the years of past practice that has been enshrined in collective bargaining agreements that are passed as a matter of law. We have a long fetch of history for these practices. And we're going to have to say, as a community and as a government, look, we can't afford a lot of this stuff anymore. As a matter of fact, we're not sure we could afford it last time it was extended to you, but what we know is we can't afford it right now. And so 2012 is going to be a very, very challenging year, because what we're talking about is sort of clash of institutional cultures and titans that has deep historical roots. So that's the mayor's challenge. He's stuck, he's really shackled by a lot of these ways that the city has operated in the past. They're going to have to be very creative. His department heads are going to have to be very creative along the way in trying to figure out ways to be more innovative and more efficient while still abiding by the letter of the law, which is the collective bargaining agreements. So what may that prompt from the administration as it comes to realize the limitations that it is facing? Well, it may actually bring pressure on them to figure out all sorts of creative workarounds themselves, in the same fashion that, any administration stuck with a difficult situation will be inclined to do. And once you start working in unusual ways with all sorts of workarounds, well, that's where issues of transparency, accountability, and oversight become very important. And so, again, good job, Mr. Mayor. Now the hard part starts. The Office of Inspector General has a now 22, almost 23-year history in the city of Chicago. The ordinance that was passed in 1989 by then new mayor Richard Daley, I think partly as a result of an accommodation reached with the Progressive Bloc, the Harold Washington folks in the 1980s, modeled it on the Federal Inspector General's statute. The ordinance actually has a very broadly stated mission. And I'm not sure that the mayor or the city council had a full appreciation for the breadth of the mission that is actually in the ordinance. Fraud, waste, inefficiency, root out, investigate. But beyond that, there is a provision that says it is the mission and the responsibility of the Office of Inspector General to promote economy, efficiency, and effectiveness in city programs and operations, and make policy recommendations as to how to promote them and to promote integrity in the operation of city government. That's a very broad mandate. And for the first 16 or so years of the office, that mandate was not fully inhabited, whether it was a matter of circumstance or whether it was a matter of sort of a rootedness to the old way, which the old ways that preceded the office were a series of internal investigative units that operated out of the mayor's office, controlled by the mayor's office, reporting to the mayor's office. And it was in 2005 with the patronage hiring scandal and hired truck reaching into the mayor's office itself that, and not appreciating maybe what that ordinance that has existed on the books for a while might actually mean, the mayor reached out and plucked David Hoffman from 219 South Dearborn. And David Hoffman looked at that ordinance and said, well, there's a lot of work here to do to inhabit the ordinance. And so he laid the groundwork for a lot of what it is that you see today from the office. He reconstituted the investigative unit to be a sort of civilian version of the FBI operating within the city. He created sort of specialized subject matter teams. He brought in some folks with some policy analyst backgrounds working with investigation. He also introduced the audit section for the office. And today, we're at a point where we've sort of reached sort of structural maturation of what it is that Mr. Hoffman had in mind. What he had in mind was a robust, full-functioning Inspector General's office. What generally the public understands or has understood my office to be is an office that's devoted strictly to investigation of misconduct. As a prosecutor, I've talked about this with David, I've said this before, it's really important to me. As a prosecutor for many years, you get exposed to lots of things in institutions, and particularly in government, that are actually pretty badly screwed up. But as a prosecutor, your job is to focus in silo-like fashion on particular malfeasance, particular bad acts and bad actors with the objective of prosecuting them and making sure that they pay to the fullest extent of the law for what it was that they were doing. And the things that are structurally wrong with the way government is operating, they may form some of the context of the case that you're putting on as a prosecutor, but that's it. You have no voice, you have no capacity, your job is done once you've gotten the sentencing done, you move on, you do not have a voice that says, hey, you know, all these things here, we ought to talk about how to fix them. And so an Inspector General's office actually affords that opportunity. They're involved in the investigation of matters with prosecutorial offices if we're talking about criminal misconduct, or themselves if we're talking about misconduct that's going to be sanctioned simply administratively. But you develop that institutional knowledge of things that are wrong, things that made possible the misconduct, whether it's control-oriented, whether it's actually culturally oriented, whether it's just operational missteps along the way. And you get to speak to those, but you can't speak to those simply as an investigator or through investigators, because investigators don't necessarily have the skill set for understanding anything beyond the fact that there's something wrong here structurally. So that's why you have auditors. go and go through the books of an operation, do a control audit, do an effectiveness audit, a program audit of some kind. And you also have policy analysts. And so those policy analysts are the ones that sort of take all of sort of the individual or compartmentalized inefficiencies, inadequacies that exist within an operation and put it into a larger context and drive it towards policy recommendations. You do program reviews that are rooted in the information that you develop on the investigation side, on the audit side, and you drive policy recommendations. In the last couple years, we've put forward a lot of policy recommendations, some of them more far-fetched than others. I'm sure somebody in the room wants to ask me about one or two of them. I'm not going to talk about Lakeshore Drive, no. But that's really where the change comes, is driving those recommendations, whether they're simple operational stuff or they speak to broader policy. And so some of the areas that we have spoken to at a programmatic level is the operation of the Minority and Women Business Enterprise Program in the city, which has been beset with fraud its entire history. It is the single most important social, economic program that we have in the city. And it is something that has been grossly understaffed, poorly managed, and Mayor Emanuel is working on it right now, working from program review reports that we have generated over the last year or two. And an example of the synergies that exist between all of those components of the office, and I should also add that those components of the office are all supported by a legal section, an administrative section, and we also are now responsible for overseeing the city's hiring processes, monitoring the city's hiring processes to make sure it's in full compliance with the Shackman Accords, or substantial compliance, I think is the legal term that's used out there with the Shackman Accords. But I want to give you an example of something recent. It was a little bit controversial. It didn't need to be controversial, but that's just the way we are sometimes, I guess. We like our controversy here in Chicago. We did an audit of a slice of a TIF that involved some projects that were built at Millennium Park. And in the context of doing that audit, what we saw was that these TIF-approved projects involve these things called redevelopment agreements. And redevelopment agreements are sort of the medium through which quite often large corporations end up with TIF money for various purposes, some of them more controversial than others. If you listen to Ben Jarafsky, they're probably mostly controversial. Those are policy debates, always worth having. But what we found was that these redevelopment agreements had within them something called the Public Benefits Clause. And the Public Benefits Clause, for many years, resulted in the direction of donations from the beneficiary of this redevelopment agreement, the corporation, to specific projects or purposes that benefited the public, this community, Chicago, in some direct fashion. So maybe you'd pay for a new street sweeper for the 43rd Ward. Maybe you'd pay for new water fountains in a park. Those sorts of things, direct funding for something that we can all obviously say is a direct benefit to the general public. Sometime around 1999 or 2000, there was a shift in that. Now, looking at these TIF RDAs and seeing these public benefits clauses, we thought there's something odd about these things. Maybe we should call it out. But there were a couple of them that were so odd that we said, okay, we're going to take it out of the audit context where we first identified the oddities. We're going to give it to investigation. And so these were investigated, how it was that certain beneficiaries were designated in these public benefits clauses. And what the investigators ran into was a brick wall. They ran into a brick wall for this reason. The people in the departments that actually administered the RDAs had no idea how it is that the beneficiaries that are designated in these public benefits clauses are actually named. They had no ownership of it. We asked the law department. The law department's actually involved in the negotiation of the final contract. They don't know where it came from. We asked the corporations that were receiving the funds under these redevelopment agreements, tell us how it is that the beneficiaries were named in the public benefits clauses. Most of them couldn't tell us. There's one exception for those from the corporations that we actually spoke to. And we said, well, did you ask about them? No. Did you question them? No. Did you make alternative suggestions as to other beneficiaries? No. Why? Are you nuts? We want the contract. We want the money. We're just going to go along. And so we ran into an investigative brick wall. There's really no accountability. There's no ownership. And so we threw it over to our policy and program people to look at it from a broader perspective. The succession of events, the various forms of exploration of this particular phenomenon, resulted in us finding that, going back to where I sort of took a detour, in the late 90s, around 2000, we went from a situation where funds were being directed specifically to very public sorts of operations and purpose to private charities. And the single biggest recurring charity to receive a mention and therefore funds through these public benefits clauses was After School Matters. Wonderful program, certainly does public-oriented and public-minded work. There is no question about it, but the head of that organization has close ties to Mayor Daley. And yet, nobody could tell us how it is that After School Matters ended up being named in the public benefits clause over and over and over again. In our old world of just focusing from an investigative perspective, here's what we would have done in the office. We can't come up with whether or not misconduct has occurred, an answer as to whether misconduct has occurred. Therefore, the investigation is simply going to be closed, end of discussion. That is a narrowly operating Office of Inspector General. By having these other components, the audit component that is digging into books that finds these sorts of oddities, and the program review component that pulls a big picture together and can sort of speak to broader thematic elements and identify sort of the policy and operational shortfalls that makes possible this phenomenon that nobody can really explain, gives us a medium to speak publicly about the phenomenon itself and raise questions publicly about the phenomenon itself. Now, because of the names that were involved, this thing was the subject of controversy, but I don't think anybody really, at the end of the day, had any issue with the fact that we were calling out a phenomenon that just really didn't look very good and really reflected a scenario where there needs to be greater ownership, there needs to be guidelines, standards that the public can see, that other charities can see, that the taxpayers can see, that corporations that are actually engaged in this process can see. A place to go to understand if you are a charity other than this particular charity or some of the more favored entities in the city, how it is that you can actually get in that game. What's the process by which I actually can put in my bid to be included on this list of potential recipients for funds? The city has all sorts of odd ways of working that have developed over the years. We have not just the core departments that you know about, we have sister agencies. Core city functions that are operated on a day-to-day basis by separate governmental entities. Public schools, it's not the core of the city of Chicago. It's a separate government agency altogether. The Park District, separate agency altogether. The Public Building Commission, through which all major public building occurs, separate agency altogether. All of those are controlled by one guy, the mayor. The mayor actually sits at the head of many of these organizations, but they're compartmentalized in terms of often how we talk about their budgets and what they mean for you as a taxpayer or as a resident of the city We compartmentalize them, and we compartmentalize our discussions of them, even though they're all part of one core. We have another problem, and that makes things very confusing sometimes to understand what our overall situation is. We've just passed the core city budget. We still need to talk about all these other budgets. If you track all of that stuff, great for you. Do you want to come and work for us? Because it's a lot of work. It's really a lot of work. And if we're talking about making informed decisions as voters and taxpayers about what's happening with our money and who we want to put in charge of managing our money, it's awfully burdensome. And so you can put forward lots of information on all of those things, but there's no one who's putting it all together for you. So that's a form of transparency that actually kind of frustrates accountability. So you look to something like an Inspector General's office to put the pieces together for you? Yeah, to a point. The jurisdiction of my office extends only to that core city budget and operation that we're talking about. It doesn't apply to CPS, it doesn't apply to the Park District, it doesn't apply to the Public Building Commission. Should it? Maybe, maybe not. We have a great Inspector General for the public schools. All right? So there is oversight there. Park District, $450 million a year budget. Is there any independent oversight? No. Public Building Commission, is there any independent oversight? That's another half billion dollars a year. No. And so even where there is some form of oversight, it's also somewhat, it's cabined. It has various degrees of effectiveness. You know, if you look to the city colleges, there's an Inspector General, but it reports directly to the board. If you look at CTA, it has an IG, reports directly to the board. And we find stuff that relates to or takes us into those other realms, and we have to stop looking at it there. I'm not even going to talk about the city council. We have to stop. And so then the question might be asked, well, can't you hand off what you know to this other Inspector General? No. No, we can't. Oversight is compartmentalized. The operations are compartmentalized. If you look at the budget for the city, the core city, you actually have to piece together a department's operations from 4 different revenue streams. Internally, 4 revenue streams. Operationally, the city and all these sister agencies. Oversight, maybe, partly, sorta, kinda, can't talk to each other. We have all of these structural complications that really frustrate an ability to have a comprehensive understanding of what's going on in our city. So you take the complications that the mayor is going to have to deal with in the forward-looking years, in the next year, 2012, let's just deal with that. It's going to sort of put all sorts of pressures on him to start, and his people to start to sort of work more creative solutions that may be sort of at the margin of how we really would want things to operate, and it may challenge their desire to be meaningfully transparent. And in the meantime, we don't have mechanisms for comprehensive accountability that comes through comprehensive oversight. That's where we are right now. So enjoy the newspaper tomorrow. Enjoy the fact that we've actually balanced the budget. Enjoy the fact that in the CTA side, they're actually, you know, Forrest Claypool is talking about meaningful reforms that need to be made, but he's going to deal with the same challenges as well. His budget is balanced in part by an assumption that he is going to be able to achieve certain outcomes in negotiations with the transit workers in the coming year. And understand, as all of that is occurring, that there really is no comprehensive oversight that exists in the city, and we don't have real accountability until we address that structural shortcoming that exists today and exists for the foreseeable future.